People hate industrial, intensive, big agriculture, and it's really easy to see why, right? One thing that these intensive agricultural operations do really well is make a lot of food with not so much land. And that is really the most important thing that agriculture has to do over the next few decades. The challenge of if we're going to feed the world without frying the world, it's going to mean, providing another 7 quadrillion calories worth of food over the next 30 years, which means about 50% more food, but we can't use any more land to do it. We're going to overconsume and overeat and, eat foods that we shouldn't eat. I have very little faith in our ability to become a much more better for the planet species, just out of the goodness of our hearts. But I have a lot of confidence in our ability to do cool technological stuff. Every farm is a kind of environmental crime scene, right? It's like a kind of echo of the nature that it replaced. And that makes it sound like farmers are terrible, but they're not. They're providing this incredibly valuable service. They're providing food that we need. We really, as they often remind us, we owe them a debt. They make it possible for the rest of us to be doctors and bankers and podcasters and authors.
The world needs more podcasters and fewer farmers, I would say. Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Welcome to the Saving the World from Bad Ideas podcast with me, Mark Lynas. I'm here today with Mike Grunwald, who's the best-selling author of 2 widely acclaimed books, The Swamp and the New Deal, and a new book, which we'll get into in just a second. He's also a former staff writer for the Washington Post, Time, and Politico, and the winner of multiple awards, to name just a couple of them: George Polk Award for National Reporting, the Worth Bingham Prize for Investigative Reporting, and many others, and lives in Miami. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark.
So the theme of this is always saving the world from bad ideas, like I say. So the bad idea that you're saving the world from in your new book is, we suggested that the bad idea could be, we should ditch intensive agriculture. Like, most people think that intensive agriculture is clearly a bad thing. We've got to get rid of it. We need to go organic, regenerative, all of that sort of stuff. So let's explore that, because you cover all of these topics in really quite, exhaustive detail. I think you said at the end you've spoken to 2,000 people. I mean, that's more than I've ever done when I've written my books. So, I mean, I'm full of admiration for your diligence. But the book's called We Are Eating the Earth, and it's published when exactly?
July 1st.
July 1st. Okay, well, that's right. So pretty soon. And, it seems to me that if there's a kind of key theme in it, it's land, isn't it? We talk a lot about carbon, we talk about biodiversity, but somehow land hasn't really become the key issue that it should in the sort of the broader environmental discourse, has it?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, people hate industrial, intensive, big agriculture, and it's really easy to see why, right? Like, they treat animals badly. They often treat people badly. They get a lot of subsidies often for no apparent reason. They make a mess in rivers. They pollute the air. They use too many antibiotics. They are a potential risk for pandemics. Lots of bad things to say about them. But one thing that these intensive agricultural operations do really well is make a lot of food with not so much land. And that is really the most important thing that agriculture has to do over the next few decades. That's why getting rid of this style of agriculture would be such a bad idea, as opposed to, trying to make that intensive, lots of food, not so much land, just hopefully with a little less mess.
Yeah, and you start with quite a deep dive into the ethanol issue, which, seems to me like, news from 20 years ago. But I think it's still going on, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah, it's
how much?
crazy.
Yeah, how much of the U.S. corn crop currently goes into producing ethanol biofuels for
It's
cars?
about 40% of US corn. And so
Wow.
it's like, it's probably 35, 40 million acres. And again, the reason I start there and my main character, Tim Searchinger, started there is that, he essentially realized that, gosh, we're using an awful lot of farmland to grow fuel, and we are not counting the effect on the climate from using that land. The opportunity cost of having that land be forests instead. Essentially, biofuels is a massive driver of deforestation. Um, and it's using a Texas worth of land. But of course, what Tim ultimately realized, and what essentially my book is about, is that, for instance, livestock use about 50 Texas's worth of land. And so the problem is really that agriculture is eating the earth. And to the extent that we have more agriculture right now, 2 of every 5 acres of land on Earth that isn't ice or desert is either crops or pastures. It all used to be nature. It all used to store a lot of carbon. It all used to shelter a lot of wildlife. And really, we can't convert a lot more nature into agriculture. So really, the challenge of, if we're going to feed the world without frying the world, it's going to mean, you know, providing another 7 quadrillion calories worth of food over the next 30 years, which means about 50% more food, but we can't use any more land to do it. And that's, people hate factory farms, but one thing factories are good at is manufacturing a lot of cheap commodities on a mass scale, and we're going to need that with food.
Okay, well, we'll get on to factory farms, good or bad, in due course. But just to go through the issues as you go through them in sequence in the book. So you've got the corn ethanol, then you've got biomass, which is basically clear cutting forests to burn them in power stations, and including here in the UK, there's a huge power station called Drax. It sounds like an evil character, doesn't it? As you say
Yeah,
in the book.
yeah, Bond villain.
Yeah, it sounds like a Bond villain, and it's almost is an environmental Bond villain. And it's kind of weird that these two things, the biomass and ethanol, sort of did start off as ideas from the green movement, didn't they? And then they kind of took on this. They became industrial lobbies in their own right, didn't they? And then when it turned out that it was actually a bad idea, it became impossible to reverse.
That's exactly right. And I think, the source of the bad idea is that all these, scientists and economists who looked at these, they did their life cycle analyses, and they were very excited because, remember, 20 years ago, there was really no alternatives to fossil fuels, right? There was hardly any wind, really no solar to speak of. And people started talking about biofuels for cars and biomass for electricity. And it's like, great, because you're replacing fossil fuels, and you're not using fossil fuels. And they literally counted it as carbon neutral. The idea being like, well, yeah, we're burning corn in a car, but then we're growing corn, so we're soaking up soaking up carbon from the atmosphere. Same with burning trees. It's like, yeah, okay, we're burning the tree up the smokestack, but then we're growing a new tree, so that's going to remove the carbon. But again, it forgot about the opportunity cost of this land. It treated land as if it was free, and land is not free. land is precious. It's kind of, at this point, it's kind of the most important environmental asset that we have. God ain't making any more of it, like Mark Twain said. And when it turns out that, if you don't count the land costs of using land, things that are really bad can look really good. But biofuels and biomass power are climate disasters that have been sold as climate solutions.
I mean, and land isn't just an asset that's a factor of production. It's also habitat, for ecosystems which are that under such stress that we're potentially in the sixth mass extinction. And so the argument you're making, I guess, is that when food, a third of the U.S. corn crop gets put into cars as ethanol, then that food that would have gone to humans has to be produced elsewhere. So that's the opportunity cost concept, right?
That's exactly right. And that's, and look, when agriculture is now, it's the leading driver of water pollution, water shortages, biodiversity loss, deforestation. I mean, it's making a big mess. And, we need it because we need food. It turns out that for biofuels, like we have something better. We have electric vehicles. Um, for biomass electricity, we have solar and wind and nuclear power that can do this job without. But for food, we really need land. We need to grow it. We need agriculture, and so really the challenge is going to be how can we grow this food to feed the world, because we can't just hand wave away 10 billion hungry people. But how can we do it without expanding agriculture's footprint to the extent that you know with some of these projections, you'd essentially need another planet.
So you land on this character, Tim Searchinger, who I admit I don't know. Um, why he's kind of an unlikely hero because he's sort of got the sort of all the qualities of an accountant, really. I mean, it's finding it's like finding and disproving other people's figures, which seem to be his modus operandi and his
You're
great superpower,
you're
right?
so
So why?
unfair. I would describe him more as a slightly obnoxious accountant. Um,
Oh, okay. Is he not brilliant?
no,
He's
but
probably even more effective in that for that reason in that case. But what?
well,
So go on. Why him? Why Tim Searchinger?
it's funny. Tim is a really brilliant guy, but a lot of what he has figured out is really simple, right? It's essentially like, hey, you got to count the cost of using land, um, and that turned out to be why he wrote the first paper in Science back when he was just an environmental lawyer. Um, Basically pointing out like, hey, all the world's scientists are doing biofuels wrong because they're not counting land. And he thought he would just write the paper and then people would be like, oh, that was silly. We were doing it wrong. But it turns out that, as you mentioned, not only are there giant agricultural industries that depend on biofuels and have a lot of political influence, but there's this cottage industry of scientists and analysts and economists who have made their careers around the idea that biofuels are great and part of the future solution to climate change. And Tim was essentially coming along and saying like, no, your work is useless. They didn't like that, and they have a lot of power, not just at land grant universities in the United States, but at the IPCC. So he's been fighting that fight. He's been fighting the biomass fight, and ultimately that led him to fighting the agriculture fight, because it's the same thing where you have a lot of people, and a lot of money pouring into solutions that will essentially make the climate problems of agriculture worse.
Yeah, I want to look at the IPCC issue because, I've spent a lot of time, like you, in the climate culture wars, and the IPCC is sort of like the voice of God. We talk about, you've got to listen to the
Right,
scientific consensus. 99% of the world's scientists say something, you've got to listen. But that
right,
doesn't mean the
right. And if you
IPCC
don't,
is
you're like a climate denier.
right,
You're
right,
like you're a bad
exactly,
man.
exactly. But that doesn't make the IPCC gospel. I mean, they got this badly wrong over a longish period of time, didn't they?
They've been really bad on this stuff, and I actually, you talk about how I tried to do some nitty gritty reporting. Like I tried to make this a fun narrative for people, but I felt like some of this biofuel stuff is so crazy, and the idea that the IPCC has been endorsing this and endorsing some really bad ideas on food and land, that I did feel a need to try to do a little bit of reporting out how it actually got so bad. And what you really saw was, these essentially biofuel shills and biomass shills who have made their career around bioenergy and are advising, not just the IPCC, but the World Bank, the UN, the FAO, the International Energy Administration. Every big international institution has this, little coterie of biofuels shills who have essentially made it their business to try to knock down competing science, and that's what happened. Initially, they just completely controlled the IPCC focus on bioenergy.
So how does that
I
work specifically? Sorry to interrupt. I mean, do they
Yeah, no.
write the chapters of the IPCC? Are they the ones who are actually compiling the sort of summary of the research? Like, how does this kind of corruption within the IPCC actually take place?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, it's sort of that simple. I told sort of two stories. One was, I guess, from 2011. They did a report on renewables, and I interviewed the guy who was in charge of that, and he had seen Tim Searchinger's science, and he said to the biofuels, the people who were doing the bioenergy chapter, "Hey, you need to look at this. This seems really important." And they just blew him off. And he said they were incredibly hostile. All the people working on the bioenergy chapter were bioenergy people. And he kind of forced them to put in essentially a caveat saying like, hey, this idea that bioenergy is inherently carbon neutral is, problematic. But then all of the studies that they relied on for their conclusions all concluded that bioenergy was carbon neutral. And so you had these sort of bad first principles and bad assumptions leading to bad conclusions. Then in 2014, they went back and looked at it again, and they actually had a guy in charge of the bioenergy chapter had no skin in the game. He was just neuroscientist who, was new to the issue. Um, and there were even a couple of people on his team who were bioenergy critics. They had a much more balanced idea, but they just, the bioenergy supporters were so adamant that, one of them described it to me as like, you weren't allowed to say that their baby was a little ugly, that they just were like, no, we will not compromise. And it ultimately went to, sort of above their head. And the leaders of the IPCC land sector sided with the shills, so much so that the guy who was in charge of the bioenergy chapter had to go write essentially a competing paper in a sort of obscure journal talking about how, basically bioenergy science sucks.
Mm. Wow, amazing story. And the other thing they come up with is this concept of BECCS, which is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Like carbon capture and storage itself doesn't really exist. And if you plug in bioenergy, which is chopping down, clear cutting trees, like I don't know who thought this was a good idea, except that it made the models add up because you could put a big gap in the second half of the century, which was carbon negative, and we're supposedly removing, billions of tons of excess carbon from the atmosphere using this BECCS thing. But what was your take on that?
Yeah, you just nailed it. I mean, it's like it was this magic asterisk where they were like, "Oh shit, we're heading past 2 degrees Celsius. We're going to need negative emissions." Why don't we just? What if we burn trees, then we grow them, and we call it carbon neutral, but then we capture the carbon at the smokestack. So then we call it carbon positive. This is like, we're saving the earth by burning trees. And and it works great if you don't count the burning trees. And so it's kind of nonsense dressed up. And, since biomass power is actually worse for the climate than coal, biomass power with carbon capture and storage, even if we're going to assume it exists and, it can work, is worse than doing that for a coal plant and much worse than doing it for a gas plant. So yes, I mean, the idea of capturing stuff at the smokestack does make things better than it would. But, like I say, it's sort of like, what if you didn't cut down the tree and burn it, right? Like, what if the tree didn't fall in the forest? And that's the kind of opportunity cost that these studies never take in mind. It's sort of like, assume we're burning a tree. It's like, well, wait, maybe don't do that. And it turns out that not doing that is a lot better for the climate, because trees are really good. And, if you had to summarize my book for, in the most simplified way possible, it's like, we should try to keep as much nature as we can, and agriculture keeps overrunning it.
Well, duh, as your hero Tim Searchinger might say.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. He also says like "doi," and he says "der." So he has all
I
kinds
can't.
of.
Yeah, can't wait to meet him. So yeah, so your Marvel superhero, obnoxious accountant, Tim Searchinger, goes and writes this report for the World Resources Institute, 546 pages, I think you say,
Yeah,
which nobody reads. I haven't read it. The press don't
yeah.
cover it. Like, it's this huge doorstop, but it has a pretty clear conclusion, doesn't it? And that's that basically one word meat, or actually beef probably, is the main issue, right? In terms of the whole "we are eating the earth" thesis, right?
Well, I think he would say that look, he has 22 kinds of solutions, and
Yeah, that's
each
too
of
many to
those have a
remember though.
million,
Like, yeah,
have millions.
I'm gonna ask you to name all 22. Like,
Exactly. At this point, I could probably do it. Like, I think the fact that nobody read these 560 pages, I made up for it by probably reading it 560 times. um, but, uh, but, uh, but yes, I mean, a huge part of the problem is, people say meat. The Lancet report kind of said meat, but that's really, you can say it's beef. And in fact, I have, since I started working on this book, I don't eat beef or lamb anymore. I still eat chicken and pork. And look, chicken and pork is not as good for the climate as, beans and lentils. And it's probably 4 times worse. But beef and lamb are probably 10 to 20 times worse than chicken and pork. And it's a huge part of the problem. I mean, pretty much two thirds of all agricultural land is now pasture land. And then if you include also the grain that they use to feed cows, you're probably getting close to 3/4 of agricultural land is used for beef and dairy. And so, yeah, if it were easy to eat less beef, that would be an awesome way to fix the problem. And definitely when I talk about, the importance of, industrial agriculture, making a lot of food, I do hear a lot of times, well, like, why don't we just stop eating beef? And I always say, like, okay, um, you know, you got a plan because the world has been eating, we eat 350 million tons of meat every year. And we're actually eating a little less beef than we did per capita. And we're eating a lot more chicken. So it is possible to shift. But I think these ideas where you can snap your fingers and just it's sort of like, oh well, people don't need to stop smoking. They should just get more exercise. It's like, okay, you know, it's great, but ultimately we're going to have to sort of do all the things.
yeah. I mean, for me, the big villain is sheep, because I live in the Welsh borders and all of our upland areas are devastated. Well, we say sheep-wrecked, I think, which was a term that was
Oh,
coined
nice.
by, I think it was coined by George Monbiot, who is a friend of the show. And like, all of you can see places in the hills where tiny little trees are trying to come through, and the sheep just get in there and you just eliminate everything. So all that you've got left is a couple of species of grass and some bracken. There's no biodiversity, no wildlife, nothing, because of these ruminants, which have very extensive grazing, probably quite low stocking rates. I mean, you don't get much
Terrible.
meat out of these ecosystems, but this is land which would, in natural circumstance, be, I think, an Atlantic rainforest, which is a
That's right.
habitat that's virtually ceased to exist on Earth. Thanks to,
That's right.
and I do occasionally eat lamb because I'm a massive hypocrite and I like the taste, but I would love to see the sheep industry, drastically reduced. But, it's
No,
sort of
that's
seen
right.
as, yeah, it's seen as this organic, this good thing that, has huge cultural power. Everyone loves farmers and all of that.
Oh
So,
yeah, beef. It's what's for dinner, right? I mean,
mhm.
and it's look, you hear all the time like, oh, these cows are magical creatures. They're turning grass we can't eat into food we can. But like what you said is exactly right. 40% of all grazing land on Earth used to be forest. Um, and the rest of it, it's not like it had no carbon benefits too. Like you're seeing a lot of cattle in the Brazilian Cerrado, which was an incredibly biodiverse savanna. It was really kind of like the Brazilian Serengeti. So it's the it's impossible to overstate the importance of beef to these climate problems. But one thing I often say, it's like, yes, so we, as particularly in the rich world, we need to eat less beef because, you know, there's still 6 billion, 6.5 billion people on Earth who eat no beef, right? And they're going to start eating more as they, you know, get richer, you know, God willing, you know, we want that. So it does mean that people in the first world are going to have to eat less. But what it also means, you know, right? Like Willie Sutton, he robbed banks because that's where the money was. Um, if you care about reducing emissions, you have to make better beef because that's where the emissions are. Um, and that means, as you said, it means making more beef with less land. That means higher stocking rates. And it turns out, you know, I did a lot of reporting. I went to Brazil, and it's there's so much degraded ranch land where there were, you know, they call it the Columbus method, where they just send out the cows in the fall and go discover them in the spring. And it's incredibly inefficient. You said the cows look incredibly skinny. You know, they look like they're hunger strikers. It's, you know, and most of these ranches, they're owned by like, you know, some guy who has a business in Sao Paulo, and it's like a tax break. There is a lot, you know, it would not be difficult to triple the productivity of ranching and beef production in Brazil. And, you know, that means it would use a third as much land. You know, you could save a few Texases right there.
I mean, the whole livestock thing is just amazing. A lot of Brazil's soy exports come to Europe to feed animals. You know, pigs,
Right.
cattle, sheep, whatever. And actually, go back to George Monbiot, had this lovely quote which always stuck with me. He said, "If you want to reduce soy, eat more soy, because you know
That's
by
right.
substituting it for beef, and you know it's so inefficient feeding soy to cattle and then eating the cattle. So it's this. That's the
That's
metric that
right.
you keep coming
And
back to, right? It's this efficiency,
And
isn't it?
soy gets a bad rap, to be honest. It's like, yes, soy gets, you know, is responsible for deforestation. So if you know, you can have your big soy moratorium and boycott soy. So great, they'll use less efficient crops, and that will require more land to provide the same amount of feed. Yes, it would be better if we ate soy in the form of tofu and you know, and edamame, right? But you know, right now we don't. um, you know, we're feeding a awful lot of it to chickens. Um, and you know, until we stop eating chickens or come up with alternative you know, the fake meat that replace chickens. And, you know, I'm all for that if we can make it taste good and make it cheap, which we are, you know, making progress towards, but have not yet achieved. Um, we're going to have to, you know, produce food efficiently. And efficiency has become this kind of dirty word, right? You know, like it's like these rapacious, evil corporations that are kind of like squeezing dollars out of the dirt. Um, but you know, efficiency, it means, you know, we should start thinking of efficiency as forest protection, as wetlands protection. Um, you know, it's not enough to have higher yield farming. That won't by itself protect the Amazon, the Congo rainforest. But I can tell you that if we don't have high yield farming, those rainforests are screwed.
Mm. And yet, there seems to have been, you know, a resurgence of interest in low yield farming. And I mean, regenerative agriculture in particular is like the latest buzzword. There's all these fads that come and go, aren't there? I think you call regen ag a faith-based transformation of food production. There was this film, Kiss the Ground, all about soil carbon. And I have kind of a reverse Godwin's law about anything RFK Jr. says. Like, if he's for it, I'm against it. And of course he's for this as well. So like, give us a story on regenerative ag and carbon farming.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, you know, it's at this point beyond fad. I mean, it's like, you know, the UN is for it, the World Bank is for it. Um, you know, you know, agribusinesses, right? Like Danone and Archel, you know, JBS, you know, you're hearing, um, uh, General Mills. This is it's definitely all the rage is that we're going to reduce our impact on the planet and the climate by shifting from these industrial practices to regenerative practices that treat the soil better. And I should say, in many ways, they do treat the soil better. But then the idea is that it's going to store tons of carbon in the soil. In Kiss of the Ground, it was going to store all the carbon that our fossil fuels have popped into the atmosphere is going to be essentially repatriated underground. Our soil is going to save us. And that's just total bullshit.
Literally.
There is the science. Yeah, exactly. The science is unbelievably thin. Even if you could measure this stuff, even if you could make sure that people who put their carbon allegedly underground then don't till the soil and pop it all right back up into the atmosphere. The science shows that essentially to add more carbon to the soil, you're going to have to add more nitrogen to your soil. And nitrogen is a huge carbon problem. That means more fertilizer and more manure. When you see somebody claiming they've increased their soil carbon dramatically, mostly what that means is they've moved cows onto their field, and which is fine, but it means those cows are now on some other field, and so somebody else is losing that carbon, and so it's essentially a shell game. There's just the Rockefeller Foundation, which, remember, they financed Norman Borlaug's original work on the Green Revolution that provided these incredible yield advances that have tripled yields since the 1960s and have made it possible for us to still have standing forests on this planet.
Well, and basically abolish famine as well, right? So
yeah, exactly. That's how we fed the world, right? When everybody said that there was just going to be, endless famine, and there were bets made, and the Malthusians were wrong. The Green Revolution was right, and we've got high yield seeds and better genetics and fertilizer and irrigation and all these wonderful advances that have made farming more productive. And now the Rockefeller Foundation, which is behind all of that, is part of this coalition of philanthropies that want the world to spend $4 trillion on a global transition from industrial to regenerative agriculture. And it's one of those things where it's like,
no one done the maths on the land use implications of this.
It's incredible. And you have these, in the United States, there's this guy, Will Harris, who has a regenerative farm really, I guess, farming and ranching operation in Georgia. And he's got this, he got somebody to do General Mills actually got somebody to do a life cycle analysis that found that it was carbon neutral. And then when you look at the assumptions, even this completely in the tank study admits that it's going to use 2 to 3 times as much land to produce the same amount of food. So like if you tripled the amount of pasture land in the United States, you'd need a new United States. It's just these incredibly bizarre assumptions that where you just hand wave away the idea that you're going to need all this land that is essentially going to come out of nature. I write in the book about the Washington Post did this incredible feature about the sort of the grain of the future. The headline was, "This new grain may be a recipe for solving hunger and climate change."
This is it's a perennial grain, isn't it?
It's the perennial grain called Kernza, done by like very nice and, by the way, very honest people at the Land Institute in Kansas. And they are right up front and they say, like, this isn't ready for prime time because, as you find out in the 38th paragraph of the Washington Post article, it takes 3 times as much land to make the same amount of grain as a wheat field. And, that is totally unacceptable. That doesn't work. But there's this idea that, except for, that one thing, it's very much a like, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Other than yields, low yield agriculture is great, but yields are the most important thing we need from agriculture.
I'm just trying to figure this out. You said, is it 2/3 of the world's habitable land which is used for agriculture already?
It's 2/5
Two
right
fifths.
now.
Okay,
It's
so if
so
you
two of
multiply,
every 5 acres. It's about half of the 2/5 of the ice-free, desert-free land is agriculture, and
right?
but it's on path to in the next 30 years. Even if we continue to increase yields at the same rate we've increased them since the Green Revolution began, so that's very steady yield growth, faster yield growth than we're getting now. We're still on track to deforest another dozen Californias by
Yeah, but
2050.
my point is let's do what the regen ag and the organic people want and reduce yields by you know down to 30% of what what they are. You have to multiply by three your land
Oh
use.
yeah.
It's already 2/5. Like, how much of the world is left for nature in that scenario?
None. Then we need a second planet. It's then it's time to start terraforming Mars or whatever. And it turns out Earth is like way better at this. Like Earth is excellent. Earth has pizza and reliable Wi-Fi and breathable air. Like, the idea
All the things we
the
need
idea
for a happy,
it's like
contented
got
life. Yeah.
really good stuff.
Hmm.
It is very well suited for agriculture. It is, as climate change gets worse, it is going to get slightly less well suited for agriculture. That's going to be a drag on yields. But so it's really important. I just did this event at Berkeley where, there were like 200 hippies and foodies in the room. Alice Waters was sitting in the second row glaring at me the whole time.
Who's she?
Oh, she's the chef of the sort of the most famous, started the slow food movement. Chez Panisse is where she, beautiful, slow cooked, slow grown, regenerative, organic food that you can, get for, just $1,000 a meal. She's like very tight with Al Gore. But the last question was the New York Times reporter was moderating, and she asked me, she's like, well, Mike, you've been giving us these facts and figures, you've been giving us this data and science, but isn't this really a moral issue? Isn't the question of industrial agriculture, it's so much bigger than these numbers? And I was like, yeah, it's a moral issue. Like, people are going to fricking starve, and climate change sucks. And if we deforest the Amazon, like, the people who are going to feel that are going to be indigenous people in the Amazon and people living in the floodplain in Bangladesh. It's not going to be rich white people in Berkeley.
Right, right. Well,
And
you know
so,
what she's really saying. She's really saying, Mike, stop with these pesky numbers and all of this
yeah.
science stuff. Just go back to your feelings. You know.
No, exactly. And this, I get this again and again where it's like, and then it's partly the anyway errors, right? Like, okay, the whataboutism. It's like, okay, fine, these numbers are terrible, but we can just stop eating beef, or we can just waste less food, or we can stop using biofuels. But even if the rich world ate 50% less beef and the entire world wasted 50% less food, and we just stopped using biofuels entirely, we're still going to need way more food with less land. So the math is really ugly. I wish it were better. I tried to make this a non Debbie Downer book. A lot of it is about potential solutions and ways we can whack away at this kind of eating the earth problem. But it's a big frickin' problem, and it's very tempting, and I see why it's alluring to say, like, oh well, if we just do this nice regenerative ag, which of course, like, we're going to give farmers a lot of money to do, and giving farmers money is always good politics, nationally and internationally. It would be really nice if that would solve all our problems. But unfortunately, it's going to be a lot harder than that, and we're going to need, you know, some agriculture that we don't necessarily love, right? I think, one of my, what I keep banging my spoon on my high chair about is that the beautiful Alice Waters Michael Pollan farms that they romanticize, right? Where, the soil is treated with love, and the animals have names instead of numbers. And, there's a diverse group of crops. It's not just these horrible monocultures that you're bombing with chemicals all the time. Like, those were an environmental catastrophe 60 years ago, right? Because they replaced nature. And it's true, like turning those, twee organic farms, the throwback farms into more intensive industrial farms, there is an environmental cost to that. But it's not nearly as big as the environmental cost of turning nature into agriculture in the first place. And when we lower yields, that means less nature and more agriculture. That's my message.
Right. So, this is the kind of land sparing, land sharing perennial debate, right? I mean, my take on this is very much a land sparing one, because I'm a fan of rewilding, and I'm a fan of natural ecosystems. And even the most nature friendly farm with its lower yield is like, I don't know, probably 1% of the biodiversity of an actual natural ecosystem that would be on that same patch of land, right?
That's exactly right. And, and you hear, and it is true, I went to Tom Steyer's farm and his ranch in California.
Who's he?
Tom Steyer is the American billionaire, big environmental climate activist, ran for president as a Democrat in 2020 on a climate platform. And he has this regenerative ranch in California that he wants to be a sort of lab for the world. And it does have like better biodiversity than it did when it was a conventional ranch. And it has more different types of grasses. But it's still a freaking ranch, and it had more biodiversity when it was just nature. And that is really the land. One line I use that farmers hate. I use this in my New York Times essay, was that every farm, even the ones with the red barns and and the farmers with the overalls and pitchforks who are feeding their pigs by hand. Every farm is a kind of environmental crime scene, right? It's like a kind of echo of the nature that it replaced. And that makes it sound like farmers are terrible, but they're not. They're providing this incredibly valuable service. They're providing food that we need. And, we really, as they often remind us, we owe them a debt.
They're not quiet, are they? They tell us that a lot.
And they make it possible for the rest of us to, to be doctors and bankers and podcasters and authors. The
world needs more podcasters and fewer farmers, I would say.
Well, it's true. It's a sign of a wealthy society, right?
Right.
When more of us can write and talk, and less of us have to farm. But the fact is, we need what they're doing, but we can't ignore that it makes a mess. And so, they like to think of themselves as stewards of their land, and some of them are, and some more than others, but collectively they are stewarding a mess. And so, it's not as, maybe not, my message is not as inspiring as the people who say our soil can save us. We can transform agriculture from a climate problem to a climate solution. I'm just saying make more food, but try to make less of a mess. Let's make a deal. And that's maybe not as exciting, but I think that's much more realistic. And to me, it's more moral, because it's a way of actually preventing climate change, right? People talk energy is still 2/3 of the climate problem, but food is 1/3, and it gets 2% of climate finance and maybe, 1% of climate discussion. We got to start thinking about this shit. And that means taking it seriously, not just these kind of airy-fairy ideas of how it's going to save the world.
Well, and there is a country that tried to implement these airy-fairy ideas in quite a sort of Trumpist radical way, which is Sri Lanka, which literally from 1 year to the next went organic, right? I mean, I think they banned fertilizers.
Oh yeah, that worked great. Yeah.
How did that go? Yeah. How did that go?
Yeah, it was amazing. It was terrific. They went from a self-sufficient agricultural economy that made all of its own rice to a frickin' basket case. They banned agrochemicals, and 6 months later, yields had crashed, and the president had to flee. It turns out that people like food. They don't want to pay way more for it. And the way to do that is to make a lot of it. It was a complete disaster. All the agronomists said what would happen. Their tea industry went organic, and that was their source of foreign currency. That was their main export market, and that disappeared overnight. And their rice, which was what Sri Lankans eat, those yields crashed almost in half. And basically, they were like, "Okay, never mind." But and obviously, we talked about this at Berkeley, and of course the agroecological people say like, oh no, it was just implemented wrong. It's kind of like communism, right? It didn't fail, it was just never tried. um, but in a
Except in
way it
North Korea and
succeeded.
the Soviet
Right.
Union and all the other places it was tried.
Yeah, it's like and look, I'm not like synthetic fertilizers have some real problems, right? We have we have a dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's all because of synthetic fertilizers coming down the Mississippi River from the Midwest. The Great Lakes, the algae blooms, those are from fertilizers. Pesticides, create real problems. They're often toxic. They're in the soil. They're in the air. But the thing is, fertilizers help stuff grow, and pesticides are really good at killing pests, and that's really important. There's this idea that their chemicals are evil, and I get it. They have some negative impacts on the environment and sometimes on human health. And that's why I'm really excited about, I wrote in the book about a biological fertilizer, where they're genetically editing microbes.
Is this the RNA one?
No, this is Pivot Bio, which genetically edits microbes to essentially fix nitrogen from the air, which they used to do naturally, but they've gotten lazy since we've pumped so much fertilizer into the soil. So they're like, oh, we don't need to do it, and they turn it off. They've edited their microbes so they don't sense all the nitrogen around them, and they start feeding nitrogen to crops again. And that would be a very exciting way to reduce our fertilizer use. You just mentioned a company I wrote about called Greenlight Biosciences, which has used the mRNA technology behind the COVID vaccines, essentially to send messages to potato beetles, which are these horrible pests. Somebody described them as kind of a cross between like an M1 tank and Cookie Monster. They just kill everything, and they just keep coming back. They're indestructible, but it sends them a message to stop pooping, so it constipates them to death. And it's instead of
I feel sorry for the Colorado beetle for the first time ever. But
yeah, well,
I guess it's better than being nuked with hideous pesticides, right?
Exactly, and it doesn't kill all the ladybugs and the good microbes in the soil. So it's more like sending in the assassin to kill the bad guy rather than nuking the entire city. And so I'm very excited about all these alternatives to some of the 20th century was really about chemistry, and it was amazing. And particularly the fertilizer is probably the most important invention of the 20th century. It's the reason why 4 billion of us on Earth are alive. And all good. Green Revolution, bravo. But it did make a lot of mess. And so I think in the 21st century, there's going to be a lot of these biological solutions that will hopefully make much less of a mess. And, instead of, I think a lot of people turn up their nose and say like, oh, we can't rely on technology. We need to, that's just going to help us be the same old kind of shitty human beings that we always have been, and we're going to overconsume and overeat and eat foods that we shouldn't eat. I have very little faith in our ability to become a much more better for the planet species, just out of the goodness of our hearts. But I have a lot of confidence in our ability to do cool technological stuff. You've written about GMOs. You've written really smart, wonderful stuff about the promise of of engineering our crops to be better crops. And in some ways, I think we both know that the health scares around GMOs are that's nonsense. In some ways, though in fairness, like GMOs haven't always lived up to their hype in terms of yield growth. But I have a lot of faith that they can, and that these newer genetic technologies will do even better. And I think like we should be excited that there are like really smart scientists who are trying to reinvent photosynthesis.
I was going to say, so
Or
just while you're on the GMO subject, what are some of the GMO type stuff that really cutting edge at the moment that gives you some hope?
Well, that like it's photosynthesis is a great example where, this is like Gates Foundation funded project. Photosynthesis does a really nice job supporting all life on Earth. It's been doing a really nice job for, a couple billion years, but it turns out it's actually quite inefficient. It's really good at perpetuating itself and perpetuating life, but in terms of making crops grow, there's some examples that like these are in the weeds, but I think kind of fun. It turns out that photosynthesis, like when a cloud passes overhead, and the sun goes away, but then the cloud goes away and the sun comes back. Photosynthesis is really bad at starting up again. It's very slow. And then the other classic example of photosynthesis is that it takes carbon out of the air and turns it into energy and fuel for the plant. But about one of every 4 or 5 times, instead of grabbing a carbon molecule, it accidentally grabs an oxygen molecule. It just kind of screws up, and that's inefficient. So they're trying to train it to. They have not yet figured out how to fix that mistake, but they've made it better.
Rubisco enzyme.
That's Rubisco, right? But they've made it better. They've made it better. They've re-engineered through gene editing. They've figured out ways to make plants better at recovering from that mistake. And again, like they're just all kinds of drought tolerant, flood tolerant, heat tolerant stuff that will be really important as climate change makes growing conditions a lot more complicated. Pest tolerant, disease or pest resistant, disease resistant, gluten free. They're like, you name it, they're going to be coming up with a lot of ways. They can edit animals so that they I watched the first ever genetically edited cow embryos inserted, and they were edited so that they would only have male offspring. Because
was this Alison
Van Eenenum.
I can never say her name, and even though she's a friend of mine, we were even in a film together. On GMOs, and but she does some amazing. I mean, she's very pro meat, right? She's not exactly a vegan, but I mean that's her business. Yeah.
But she's like, let's make it better. Let's make it more efficiently. And so the U.S. FDA just approved a genetically edited pig that's going to be resistant to a really bad swine disease. So I think there's a lot of exciting technologies. What I always say is like, we're sitting there, we have these devices in our pockets that like, you can video chat with anyone anywhere around the world, and you can look up any fact that humans have discovered within 3 seconds. And also you can use it as a flashlight. I mean, like the idea that like, oh, well, we can't do that seems kind of crazy. Like really smart people are really smart. And so I think like this problem of like, oh, how can we make more food per acre? That seems like a solvable problem. I mean, there are biological limits, but we did it in the past with the Green Revolution. We tripled how much food we can make per acre. And I think we're going to probably have to double it again. But there seems like there's a lot of exciting ways to do it. And then on the demand side, I'm excited about the idea of, growing, cultivated meat grown from animal cells without killing animals and without animal agriculture, or maybe use.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a bit more about the alt proteins thing, because like I'm a wannabe vegan. I think veganism is a great idea for everyone, like except me, largely because
exactly. I agree. Other people should do it.
Yeah, they really should. I want everyone to listen to this podcast to be vegan, so I can have.
Yeah, no, you really should.
It's offsetting. I can eat your steak in that case, but like so, given that we need this, we sort of a lot of us are just kind of addicted to this protein hit that you get from meat.
Yeah.
What's the what's the latest in the whole alt proteins revolution? Is it really going to be able to come up with plant-based alternatives or cultured meat from cellular feedstocks? Or is that really going to be able to make a dent in the livestock agriculture problem?
Well, it certainly hasn't yet. And look, I mean, we've been eating our species, or like varieties of our species have been eating meat for 2 million years. It actually, we sort of evolved the way we did once we started eating meat. The sort of successful hominids were meat eaters, and they got smaller stomachs because they didn't have to digest as much, plants, and they got bigger brains essentially because they had to, they evolved to go find meat, which was a little harder than finding plants. Um, and so I think, certainly I started this reporting at the Good Food Institute conference in 2019. And the Good Food Institute is sort of the kind of trade group for alternative proteins of all kinds. They're sort of leading the charge. And at that time, Beyond Meat had just gone public. It's still the biggest popping IPO in the United States in the 21st century. It was trading. It was like its market cap was half of Tyson's. I mean, it was like I thought I was going to accidentally raise a Series A round on the drinks line. It was insane. It was just like, in 5 years, we're going to get rid of meat, maybe 10, and it turns out like people really like meat. It's going to be really hard. A lot of these products, they were not as good and more expensive than meat. They've taken a lot, they were sort of, they,
I've not found a single. I mean, I think the Impossible Burger is pretty good, but I've not found a single plant-based burger or plant-based meat substitute which is anything like meat or anything.
well, I will say
half as
this:
good.
the chicken nuggets, right? They've cracked the code on chicken nuggets now.
Because
Like,
they don't taste of anything anyway. Yeah.
chicken nuggets are barely meat anyway, and they're just like a vehicle for sauce. But plant-based, like, if you eat chicken nuggets, you really shouldn't. You should really get the plant-based kind. They're just as good. Otherwise, I totally agree with you. Impossible is good. Beyond, even though I really like the CEO, is not good, I think. And they're both more expensive. Um, but what I also point out is, like, this industry, like the idea of trying to make um, fake meat for meat eaters is an industry that's about 15 years old. And we spend about 100 times more globally um, every year or every quarter on solar energy than we have spent in the history of plant-based and cultivated meat research. So I think these are very early days, and I think this stuff will get better. Cultivated meat, I've tried cultivated sushi, cultivated lox, cultivated burgers, cultivated pork meatballs, cultivated chicken fillets.
And
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 they're
cultivated is actually from animal cells, right? Just to be
from
clear.
animal cells, like
Yeah.
grown in essentially in like in a brewery.
Mm-hmm.
They call it lab grown meat, but
Yeah.
it won't be in a lab for long. Um,
So
and that
what's it
is
like?
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that, even mixed with plants, it tastes like meat.
Mm.
Or at least it somehow sends that meat, hello, it's meat to your brain.
But I can't buy
Because
it
it
anywhere.
is.
I mean, there's
It's
nowhere I
not
can
on
buy
it's
that stuff.
not Yeah, it's not ready. It's not there yet. And we're going to start seeing, like, you can buy it in Singapore now. It's just coming on some restaurants in Australia. Um, the first US company that's going to be doing a blended pork, like cultivated pork fat in a blended plant-based meatball. That should be available, I think, this year.
I bet they'll
But
ban it in Europe because any kind of
well,
food related innovation is bad for bad in
they
Europe.
banned it in Italy, and they
Right.
banned it in Florida, where I live, because the cattlemen went to Ron DeSantis and said, like, we don't like this, and these are Biden burgers. And so it's the politics are going to be difficult. The getting people to eat it. It's going to be a novel food. People don't like technology in their food. That will take time, and the costs, which 5 years ago or 3 years ago, people were saying it, like there was a New York Times op-ed calling cultivated meat the revolution that died on its way to dinner, saying this will never happen. But actually, these companies are making really good progress, and I think it will happen. It just won't happen soon, at the kind of scale that's going to be necessary to make a dent in 350 million tons of meat a year.
Hmm. I mean, I agree. I think alternative proteins has to work, and the
Right.
innovation's barely even started in that whole sector. So it will work, but at the moment you've got a substandard product which costs more on the supermarket shelf, which is a
Yeah.
tough sell to meat eaters who
Right.
are
But
used
we'll
to getting
make it up in volume, right? It's
right,
like,
right.
I don't know.
But before we end, I want. So, what's the advice you give to meat eaters in that case? Like, should they buy the cheap factory farm stuff, which is produced more efficiently, or should they buy the organic, free range, regenerative? Like, you've got to decide. You've got to tell it which is
Well,
it.
from a climate perspective, yeah, buy the cheaper stuff. Yeah, buy the industrial stuff. I mean, in most places, you don't really have a choice. I mean, like 99% of U.S. meat is factory farmed. Um, but I think the main thing I would tell meat eaters is be like me. Just eat. I eat no beef. I would say eat less beef, and eat more chicken. And yeah, try to eat more plants too. Um, but I am a big believer in better is better than worse. And I think the kind of climate movement has done itself a disservice by, talking about all these deadlines, right? Like we need to, reduce emissions 43% by 2030, or else it's game over for the climate, right? And the fact is there is no game over for the climate, right? There's better and worse. And I mean, 43% would be great. 44% would be better. 42% would be not as good, but way better than 41%. And I think that's sort of how we need to think of these things, like, just incremental progress, better policy, better corporate behavior, and yeah, better individual behavior too. But it's sort of moving the needle with technology, with government action, and with some common sense, where I feel like, we have to make sure that these really dumb ideas, that have incredible, they sound compelling, and they have incredible juice right now, where like you've got the Dalai Lama and King Charles and, the UN and the World Bank and, PepsiCo and, and Bobby Kennedy and Al Gore all singing kumbaya about this stuff, about like, low yield, more natural, kinder and gentler agriculture that, they don't say very loudly makes less food per acre. I think we got to fight those ideas, because, that would make things worse, and worse is worse than better.
Well, you're on the right podcast for this, because this podcast is about saving the world from bad ideas, and you've mentioned more than just one. So there was biofuels, there was the biomass thing, there's regenerative agriculture. I mean, you've got at least three significantly impactful bad ideas already. So yeah, it's
Well,
If you're allowed to have more than one, I think you probably nailed it on this one.
Well, yeah. I mean, tearing down forests for no reason
Hmm.
is really a bad
That's
idea.
a really bad
Um,
idea.
and uh, and uh, and I'm really appreciative that you're out there fighting bad ideas, because there are so many.
There's so many. I mean, we got 1,000 podcasts almost almost programmed in, because there's so many bad ideas out there. Look, and we'll wind up, but you have a nice little section in your book which says to recap, and I'm going to read this out because it's a really useful summary. It says to recap: biofuels and biomass power, supposedly climate saviors, are climate disasters. Carbon farming and vertical farming are wildly overhyped. Plant-based meat has floundered in the market, while cultivated meat hasn't even made it to market. Genetically modified and edited crops and livestock still face all kinds of political and cultural obstacles, and a slew of other promising solutions: methane-suppressing feed additives, nitrogen-controlling biofertilizers, high-tech fish farms, high-yield pongamia, is that right, are struggling to
Yeah.
scale. Yeah. So, there's just so much information packed into this book, and I would really recommend everyone who's interested in the subject to go and read it. It's called We Are Eating the Earth, and it's out in July. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining us. I've learned a huge amount, and I'd love to have you back soon. And in the meantime, keep enjoying the non-organic beef. No. What is it again? You eat chicken, right?
I eat chicken and pork.
Yeah, keep enjoying lentils.
I really appreciate it, Mark. You've done God's work on this stuff, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.